Hello and welcome to Fork in the Road. My name is Rusty Gaylord. I'm the host, and I'm super happy to be with you today and to be welcoming Eric Bensley. Fork in the Road is a conversation with successful people who've done cool things in their life and who've accomplished great things. And it's an exploration of how did they get there? What are some of the forks in the roads, the decisions that they made in order to navigate to this point in their life? So throughout the conversation, we are live. If you have questions or comments, put them in the chat. Sometimes there's a delay for them to show up, but we welcome those and happy to respond to those. And so Eric Bensley is a marketing VP at Salesforce, and we're just going to dive right in. So welcome, Eric, to Fork in the Road.
Thanks, Rusty. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, so one of the things that stood out about you, Eric, is you're pretty open about who you are and your personality type, and being an introvert, and yet being in a pretty significant leadership role. And your career also stands out because you started as a marketing analyst or a marketing specialist, and you've climbed the ladder all the way to being a vice president. And along the way, you went from kind of showing up in the corporate mold to being more authentic and being yourself. And I'm curious, how did you make that transition? What was it that caused you to say, I'm going to stop pretending to be this corporate version of me and actually be me?
Thank you for asking that question. It was certainly a journey, but I think early in my career, I had a lot of mentors that showed me how to show up, right? How to present, how to be in meetings. And the majority of the time they were extroverted. And so they showed me kind of their way of showing up. And there's a bit of advice that I've always hated. I've written about this, which is fake it till you make it. Many of us have probably heard that one. But a lot of the advice was that, show up like you know everything. Show up like you are confident, you have that perspective, answer questions quickly, all that stuff. And actually I had a moment when I was doing an executive briefing at a prior company where I was showing up with a deck that wasn't mine, and I was faking it till I made it, right? And I was up on stage, and an IT executive asked me a very pointed question, which kind of floored me because I had no idea. I had some idea, but for the most part, I had no idea what the slide was about that I was presenting on. And I got a really pointed question, and I was just honestly, at this point, I don't remember what I said, but it was probably something not super articulate. And I realized at that point, like, how much stress it was causing me to try to pretend to be somebody that I wasn't. And so for me, that was kind of a turning point. And I realized how much of my anxiety around work was not because I wasn't capable, but it was because I was trying to show up as somebody that I'm not. And that's incredibly anxiety inducing. Unless you're an actor playing a role in a movie, like, if you're trying to pretend to be somebody in your day-to-day life, that is more emotionally stressful than any of the work you're going to do. And so kind of since that point, I've been finding a little bit more of like how my natural disposition, my natural self helps in the corporate world, where I have blind spots, all that stuff, and just showing up more as who I am. And I think, like, it has been gradual. I've done little things, and I've seen that people appreciate it, right? So I get that kind of positive reinforcement when I show up as myself, when I tell a really bad joke, which anyone that works with me knows that it's something that is true to my brand. You just get that positive reinforcement, and you see that people want to see you as who you are. They don't want to see that corporate kind of stereotype. And so, that's kind of how I got here. And I, to this day, I feel like helping people show up as themselves at work and being congruent across personal and work life is just a huge part of, just people being happy with their job.
So just I want to respond to that. I just want a quick shout out to the people putting comments in the chat. Great to see you and welcome. So happy to have you participating here via chat. And Eric, I want to follow up on that because that sounds great, right? Everybody wants to be authentic. Everybody wants to be congruent between their work life and their personal life. But so many of us were just brought up to believe, well, hey, this is how I have to show up in order to be successful, right? The fake it till you make it, the advice that you were given, right? You've got to have the answers. You've got to be professional. You like, so how did you start to make that transition? What were the first things you did to put a crack in that armor, if you will, to put it to start to show up more as you rather than this corporate image that so many of us have?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say is, you can't be 100% congruent, right? Like at work, you have to show up in certain forums. You can't just come in like you're walking into your living room or, with your best friends. Like that's unrealistic. Like they're a little bit different, right? But I'm talking about bringing them much closer together. In terms of what I did, it's like little kind of experiments almost, right? So I used to do presentations that were just like very buttoned up and use the corporate template, and this is exactly how they're done, font size, like all this stuff. And then I would use my talk track to stray off of there, in any way I wanted to. But I started opening up with more humor, right? I mean, that's something that I do constantly offline on Slack with my coworkers, with my friends and stuff. And it was just never part of my corporate identity. Like I was this buttoned up, serious person. And so I started just like throwing, a bad joke to start a presentation, or, poking fun at something that we were doing. And so that might not be the thing for you. But for me, it was not like the next day I was like, okay, I need to be myself. And I just show up myself. It was just like, okay, I'm going to assert a little bit more of myself in here and just see what the response is like. And it's been positive as it's gradually grown. And I get more confidence that the people I work with like to see me. The more I do it and the more I get that positive kind of reinforcement. So it kind of starts small, but for me, that was my journey.
Yeah, that's good. That's great. One of the things that you said that I really love is the idea of doing an experiment. I think so many of us think, well, if I show up as myself at work, it's like a switch I flip and I can't ever go back. And what you're describing is, well, no, try a little experiment and see what happens. There's a really interesting question here from Brenda asking, this all sounds great once you've had a certain degree of success. But when you're beginning your career or when you're just starting out, you kind of have to play the game. And curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think you have to, and hi, Brenda. I've worked with Brenda in a former company. It's great to see you, Brenda. I think you have to have the trust of the team that you work with to start to expose that. And so trust is another huge thing that I'm very passionate about. And so for me, I have to have that trust with my manager, with my core stakeholders before I it's a spectrum, right? I can't be too casual when I'm just sort of starting out a relationship. I think you do have to have more, I would say, trusted relationships, sort of build up that before you really kind of share your full authentic self, if that makes sense. So I think it is a process to get there. And it's based on trust that people trust this is you, this is really you. You're not trying to like fabricate any of the stuff that you're doing. And you have to work up that relationship to, be able to show up that way. And it takes time. I think that's a very fair point.
Yeah, it is. And it's also interesting because when you talk about something like humor, right? Humor can actually build trust. Or talking about other aspects that are not work related necessarily, but a little bit more personal, are ways of building trust that can actually facilitate those relationships. So it becomes an interesting kind of dynamic of chicken and the egg, right? It's like, well, you need trust in order to be more yourself, and yet being more yourself can also help to build that trust.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I want to. I know one of the things that you've being more authentic, one of the things that you've talked about is that you're an introvert. And I'm curious, like, as an introvert, does that introduce any kind of extra challenges or opportunities for you as a leader?
Yes, it does. It does. And so, my journey, it ties to the first question, but in marketing, and I've always been in marketing, which makes me kind of unique in my career. Um, I would say I was surrounded mostly by extroverts, right? And so, like, the model that I saw was, just say what you're thinking, right? Like, that was like, you think of something in a meeting, just say it. And that's just never how my brain's worked, right? Like, my brain has always been, it needs to go through this process of vetting in my head before it comes out of my mouth. And so one of the things that really has helped me, again, like, I love the theme of experimentation, right? I'm big on that across the board. People think of their careers too linearly, and careers are really a series of experiments. And so an experiment for me as an introvert in meetings was shipping a thought out earlier and seeing what happened, right? So that's also something that when I talk to people that struggle in meetings, which is something that introverts struggle with, right? Like, especially in a virtual world where you have to signal, you have to jump in, you have to interrupt, like, all that stuff is really hard for people that don't have that disposition. The test is, say something before you feel like you're ready to say it and see what
Mhm.
happens. And then keep doing that. And for me, my personal experience was the outcome of the meeting, the outcome of the project. I was more connected to it. Whether my answer was wrong or right, never really seemed to matter to people. Obviously, I'm not saying just anything that comes to mind, right? Like, I'm just saying something that I'm thinking as somebody's asking a question or saying it earlier than um, my brain is telling me it's ready, right? And over time, that has really, again, the positive reinforcement, myself feeling more connected to the topic, to the project, um, as well as myself feeling like I have more impact that way, has been my reason to sort of go there, which is not my disposition, like I said. Um, but yeah, so sort of sharing earlier, I think, is always something that as an introvert you have to do if you want to be sort of successful in these dynamic environments. Um, and then I think the other thing is um, having diverse mentors too. So that's another thing
Mhm.
that's been important for me, because some people are, for me, extroverted mentors pull me into places I wouldn't go to
Mhm.
naturally, which is super valuable because I am very cautious about, especially social events, those types of things. I get pulled into those things by my extroverted colleagues. But then my introverted sort of mentors can show me, like, more of a model of how I could be in that role, right? So you kind of need both to, it, if you skew one way or the other, it's not good. You kind of
Mhm.
need both perspectives to, like,
Mhm.
lift you up and inspire you to take the actions that you need.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought mentors in because I know that's a big passion of yours, both having mentors and being a mentor. And I'm hoping we're going to have time to come to that. But I want to just ask a question that Mellerick, and I'm sorry if I'm not getting your name right there, asked, which is how can, as a leader, how can you help your employees bring their authentic self to work? Right. So, I mean, you're just giving some suggestions here, right, which are great. But if you like, how do you create that environment where people can be more themselves?
Absolutely. Hey, Mel. I also,
Mel. Okay.
Mel's great.
Nice.
Love Mel. Thanks for joining and asking the question. Um, for me, it's, I think, especially at large companies, we rely too much on, like, process and guidance versus action. So how do the I don't tell people to be authentic, right? Like, that's not helpful. I I try to show them a little bit of glimpse of like how I do it, to hopefully show them that it's okay for them to do it, right? That's it, for me. That's how I see changes happening. And you probably see this with any type of thing within an organization. Your leader can say things many, many times, but until they do them, I mean, why would you do them, right? So for me, that's the simple answer is like you have to be vulnerable first, right?
You got to walk the talk.
Yeah, exactly. You got to show up not polished. You have to show up and say, this thing was like, whatever it is, like this presentation last week scared the crap out of me. Like I lost sleep for 2 nights, and it might have looked great, but like that's just one example. But you have to walk the talk, right? You can't just tell people to be authentic and then show up in this like stage ready state with your team and expect that they're going to be vulnerable when you're not.
Yeah, great point. So I have a hypothesis here, and I want to check this out with you, that actually the people who are most successful are the ones who are more authentic. That when you're trying to be someone that you're not going to be as successful. And so one of the things I'm curious about, and we were chatting about this a little bit earlier, is this transition from the person who's getting the work done to the person who's leading it. And usually that happens around the director and the VP level. And authenticity in my hypothesis is a part of that transition. But I would love to hear from your perspective, for either whether it's in your own personal experience or in people on your team or people around you that you see who are making that transition into that director and VP level. What is it that you think the key factors to getting promoted to that level?
Yeah, I think up until that point, to what you already said, it's about what you're able to do, what you're able to accomplish, the execution of your role, right? Mm-hmm. And the switch it's not linear. Again, like it's a different mindset. It's kind of like so I mean, I'm a big basketball fan, so I'm going to use an analogy here, which I won't use for too long, but the player coach thing is a transition. A lot of NBA players try to coach, and only a few of them become great coaches, and that's because it's different, right? You can be extremely gifted as an athlete, score 1 million points, and have no idea how 5 players should play together, and the defensive sets that you need, and how to match up against other teams, right? So you can be extremely talented as an individual, but not be a coach. And so if you sort of take that analogy over to the working world, it's not as much about the work that you do, the things you assign, all of that. It's more about the way people feel about working with you, right? And that is a much more qualitative than quantitative. Trust is huge to that. Do people trust that you're actually thinking about things in a fair way and making decisions in that fair way? And do they trust you to operate their team and their livelihood and all the things that go with it? And I think a lot of the times that is doing the harder things that are not as shiny, if that makes sense. So like, it's not about like shipping this next or launching this product. It's about having that extra conversation with somebody who is going to wonder why we did something a certain way. And if you don't have that conversation, is going to wonder if you're considering everyone on the team when you're making decisions. So those relationships, the way people feel about working with you is so much more important. And the other thing that I think is a little bit different is as more of that like execution type of role, you can get by on sort of just doing things fast at other people's direction. You don't have to sort of, I guess, intuitively get why we're doing certain things, right? You can just execute. But in the next level role, people are going to look at you and say, why are we doing this? And you can't say because so-and-so said so. I mean, that's part of it always. It's always part of it. But you have to stand up and say, here's why they said it, but it's also a good idea. Or here's what's happening in the business, and here's why I believe this is the right thing to do. And so taking it from like assigned work to like, here's why we're doing this, that's a mindset shift. And again, it's not linear, right? Like it's yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great. It's great. I mean, that you're talking about ownership. You have to take some ownership or some responsibility.
Yeah.
And that's where I think authenticity comes back into it, because you've got to believe in it, right? You're not just adopting this because somebody told, and doing it because someone else told you to do it. The other thing that you mentioned there, and I want to tie this back to something you said earlier, was like, it's about how the people on your team feel about working with you. And I'm going to go back to the example you described at the beginning of this, which was standing in front of a room, presenting a slide that's not your slide, and getting this pointed question.
Yeah.
You said, I don't really remember what I said. You don't remember the content, but you certainly remember the feeling.
Yeah.
And I think that, there's a great quote about that, is people don't remember what you say, but they remember how they felt.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, just to kind of bring the mentorship topic back in here. What's something that you took away from a mentor relationship, someone that you had as a mentor? What's something you took away from one of those that's still something you remember and apply today?
Yeah. This is something that stuck with me. I think I posted this on LinkedIn as well. One of my mentors, I was sort of struggling with the fact, I think I was like senior manager level at the time. I was just starting to get some bigger projects, and I was trying to figure out how to have more impact with them. And I was sort of talking about the fact that it felt like it was kind of messy, right? Like I was saying, well, I don't know who owns this. Like, I don't know what this conversation's about. It doesn't seem like we have the vision, the direction. And he used a football analogy. I feel like I'm going heavy on the sports today. This one, I don't think you need to know football to understand. But he sort of used the analogy of leaning into a tackle or leaning into contact, which happens in a lot of sports where two people are about to collide, and you have two options, which is you can either lean in to that contact, or you can kind of like back away from it. And what you find, for if you've played sports, is when you lean out of it, the contact is much worse usually, because you get hit off balance and you kind of fall backwards, and the other person has an advantage. When you lean into it, it's usually not as bad because you're ready for it. And so his advice was, you have to lean into those conversations, because if you have to be on good footing when you go into a dynamic and sort of ambiguous situation. Because if you do that, if you lean out, you're going to get hit by it in a really weird way where you aren't prepared for it, right? And that analogy really worked for me. You have to lean into ambiguous situations, not sort of wait for them to develop. So that one's always stuck with me. When I see that sort of ambiguity, I don't want to like shy away from it. I want to jump in and be like, this doesn't make sense to me. Or have we thought about this? Or right? Because when you start to insert yourself in that ambiguity, you get more clarity. You pull away from it, you're going to get hit by it and not really have the context, and you're going to have to move fast to figure it out. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. I love that. Leaning in. And it's so connected to everything else that you've been talking about, right? Which is this idea of taking ownership for things rather than just doing what you're told, right? So you get in there and you help to figure it out. So really great. So Eric, we connected on LinkedIn. I know that people can find you there. You post about these topics, so there's great content for you there. So are you like, can people reach out to you there on LinkedIn? Is that a good place to find you and connect with you?
Yeah. That's great. LinkedIn is probably the social place that I spend the most time. I'm not on the other social networks as much, so it's perfect.
Awesome. Well, we could continue this conversation a long time. This has been great, but we're going to wrap it up. And I just want to thank you for being open, for being authentic, for being yourself, for having a real conversation about showing up at work in a way that's not quite the corporate stereotype, but in a way that is right for you and obviously is effective. So thank you for sharing your experience with us.
Yeah, and thank you, Rusty, for your thoughtful questions and how you've reached out. I've enjoyed talking to you and getting to know you more.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thanks for everyone for your comments and questions along the way. So we do this every week with new and interesting people. So tune in next week and join us then. All right. Thanks, Eric.